All right, there, guys. Hey, I kind of alluded to this yesterday. This isn't going to be like the end of the discussion, but let's get this started. We were talking about like some of the greatest teams of all time. I guess we were talking about the greatest offenses of all time. There is a question that nobody talks about when it comes to this debate, right? We always think about the teams that have like the biggest one-loss records, and we think about, when we talk about dynasties, we think about teams that are super outliers in terms of runs scored or runs allowed, and that have moved way beyond what all the other teams are at and stuff like that, which is all well and good, and it's probably at least a place to start thinking about this question, but it's not the only place to think about the question. The question I have for you today is, if a team is involved in a pennant race, does it require them to aspire to a higher standard of greatness than it does for teams not involved in a pennant race, right? It's kind of a complicated thing. It's kind of a difficult question to like really, I guess, wrap your head around completely. But I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So we're going to look at one of the more famous teams of all time, which is the 1939 Yankees. I mean, this team needs no introduction, right? This was the year that Lou Gehrig played for 8 games and then went under, never came back, right? This is the year of Joe DiMaggio having a real standout season in terms of offensive capability. Every one of these players, Red Wolf, Charlie Keller, George Selkirk had great seasons. Joe Gordon, of course, who we've seen a lot with the Indians in 1949. Joe Gordon had a standout season as a young 24-year-old. Bill Dickey at catcher played well. Tommy Henrik, there's another name we've seen a lot of, also had a good season, and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, Frankie Crissetti had an off year, and then, of course, Babe Dahlgren, the famous replacement for Lou Gehrig, did not play very well. Now, the interesting thing, though, about the Yankees, when we go over here and we look at their schedule, so if you know how to do this on Baseball Reference, you can actually see here exactly when they win the pennant. You can see where they win the pennant because their CLI, the championship leverage index, is suddenly 0. That means that this particular game has absolutely no bearing on the championship. So we haven't talked much about championship leverage index yet. This is one of these sort of newfangled, stats that none of us care about, but actually is kind of useful. It's useful because it helps us figure out like when the pennant race actually, or when games actually mattered for the pennant race and when they didn't. Right, so it will also tell us, I don't think, can we sort by this column? Let's see if we can. I think we can if we go all the way up. We can play around with it a little bit. You can see that the Yankees in 1939 won the pennant early and were dominating because the game with the highest championship leverage index, in other words, the game that had in the regular season with the highest probability impact on the team's probability of winning the World Series, was played on Monday, May 29th, which is pretty early. At some point in time, I do want to do a little study on this and look at what championship leverage index means when we look at teams that dominated the league versus teams that did not dominate the league so much, and whether it can tell us something interesting about the teams and about how dominant they were. In the case of the Yankees, championship leverage index tells us that their May 29th game was probably the most important game of the season, followed by the doubleheader the next day. And on and on and on. I mean, the latest game that we're seeing here is July 9th against the Red Sox, a game that they lost, right? If we're looking for like September games, we're not going to see them here. I mean, even games in August are like impossible to find, right? That tells you like the first August game is I think is down here, against the Philadelphia Athletics. I mean, by this time the Yankees, I guess they were only up by 6 games, but pretty much had things sewn up by that time. So it gives you kind of an idea of how this works, how championship leverage index can be used. We can use that, though, to see that the Yankees clinched on this day. They clinched on September 6th, right? So starting at September 7th, the games don't really count because the Yankees have already won the pennant. This amount of time was featured by games that did not matter. Right, so this is game 131 through game 152. There are 21 games here that really don't matter. The Yankees won most of these games, right, which is part of the reason why they had such a great regular season record. In fact, I mean, if you're looking through at some of the teams that they played a lot of the dregs of the American League. And I'll show you something interesting here, though. When we go back and we look at how the Yankees did, how they scored so many runs? They scored a whole ton of runs because, they beat the Athletics 21-0 in 8 innings on August 13th in the second game of the doubleheader, right? 34,000 people over at Shibe Park who were pretty upset. They actually lost the first one on a walk-off 12-9, and then they came back with 21 runs. This series, they won the first game 95, the second one 18-4. So they dominated the Athletics. Athletics in 1939, not exactly a great team. Same thing happened here with the Washington Senators. Actually, they lost this series, but they still dominated it in terms of offense. When you start looking through this, you'll notice that the Yankees are scoring tons and tons of runs against teams that had poor pitching staffs. Look at this against the Philadelphia Athletics in this doubleheader again at Philadelphia. In front of 21,000, they win the doubleheader by a combined score of 33-2. Right? That's the sort of thing that will get your offense pushed up in a way that makes you look like you're one of the greatest teams of all time, right? If we're looking at runs scored versus runs allowed, and if we're looking at win totals, the things that will help you is dominating teams, beating bad teams by like 20 runs, and then winning the pennant early, and then continuing to win after you won the pennant. And that's exactly what the Yankees did, right? Now let's look at a different team in contrast to this, and you'll probably understand sort of what this is. It's not so much an argument as it is kind of an observation. 1940 Detroit Tigers won. They won the pennant in a really, really close pennant race. This was a standout year for Hank Greenberg, Rudy York, who isn't remembered that much, Charlie Gehringer, who's remembered a little bit more these days, Barney McCoskey, who I've actually never heard of. This was a team that had Bobo Newsom, Tommy Bridges, Schoolboy Rowe, remember him. Hal Newhouser was a young kid just starting up then. He's a star from 1949. And when we take a look at the Detroit Tigers, we see something that's completely different. So we scroll down here in the schedule, we can see that this was the game. This game pitched by Floyd Giebel. I'm going to have a article about him pretty soon, that he won over Bob Feller on September 27th, 1939. That was the third to final day of the season. And he won in front of 32,000 at Cleveland. Surprising that crowd was so small, actually. I have to dig into the papers, see what happened. And this was one of the biggest games of the season, right? This was a game that was at the very, very end of the season and helped the Tigers win the pennant, right? So they only had 2 games afterwards, 2 games that they lost, the second of which they lost 3-2 in 14 innings. So I'll do the championship leverage index trick again. Believe it or not, that game was not quite as important as a game against Cleveland that came a couple days earlier where Schoolboy Rowe won in a shutout. The way to understand this is that this game put them, I think, up by 2 games or so. If we go back here and we look at this, they put him up 2 games up on top of the Indians. This is calculated, I believe, and we'll look into this later on. This is calculated, I think it takes into consideration the opponents that you have left to play and the opponents the other teams have left to play as well, right? This was another big win on September 20th that put them 1 game up, right? So that was a pretty big series before that final series of the season where the teams were jockeying for first place. Anyway, so that's the one that gets the biggest championship leverage index. But when you look over here and you look at these high leverage games, what do we see here? September, right? There's that big game that wins them the pennant. All of this is September. Oh, then we have a game in August again against the Indians, and then more September games, August, September. You see that? It's all high leverage. These are all really, really important games that they're playing at the end of the season. So the big question that we have here is how in the world can we say that this team, the 39 Yankees, was clearly far superior to the 1940 Tigers? Right? Because the 39 Yankees win the pennant in early September. They have almost a full month's worth of games that are unimportant, right? Theoretically speaking, if they won basically any game after, or if they lost any of these games after August 24th, it wouldn't really have mattered that much because of how improbable it would have been that any of the teams would have caught up to them anyway, right? Whereas in the case of the Tigers, if they had lost any of these games that they ended up winning, see if we can find a close run, right? So this Friday, September 20th game against Cleveland, right? The Tigers win this one. They get 5 runs in the bottom of the 8th inning. They almost blow it at the end. Bob Feller ends up with the loss. Hal Newhouser with the win. If the Tigers give up 3 runs in the top of the 9th instead of 1 and lose it 7-6, that's going to be a big problem for them in terms of their ability to win the pennant, right? You see what I'm saying? I mean, the leverage and the amount of importance attached to these games at the end of the season is huge. It absolutely dwarfs everything that happened before. right? Or in contrast to the Yankees, right? The Yankees are playing mostly scrubs. Everybody's a scrub in 39. In 1940, the Tigers have these really close games against the Indians, two different series against them, and they're playing the Yankees here, and they're playing the Indians up here again, right? And so that's sort of my argument, right? Which is that it's difficult for me to look at this and to say that the Yankees were clearly a superior team when it is certainly possible that the Tigers had much stiffer competition and that their won-loss record doesn't necessarily reflect that because the teams were a bit more even, right? In other words, the fact that you have one team that has completely dominated the league and clearly has dominated the league does not necessarily make them a great team in that sense. There is an argument that pennant races and the importance of pennant races could outweigh the importance that we attach to winning games by large margins or winning the pennant by a whole ton of games, right? I think you could make an argument that some of these closer pennant races and some of the teams inside them and involved in them had to play a lot harder and rougher baseball than the teams that were able to win, the pennant in early September and kind of coast on to victory, right? A famous example of this, and then I'll shut up and get on with my day, is if we look at the famous 1986 Mets. I was actually watching this game the other day. So they win the pennant. They win. So the championship levers index disappears back there. They win the pennant. I'm trying to remember which game it is. It's got to be one of these. Probably this one here against the Cubs, I believe. Is this a night game? Yeah, but I think I might be wrong on this because I think that the game afterwards was actually a day game. At any rate, so they beat the Cubs to win the pennant. This probably was this game. And then if you look at the next game that they play, which I think is this. Yes, it's this one. I was watching this game on YouTube just the other day. You can see that they have all of their second string guys out playing, right? I bring them up because when you look at the Yankees of 39, you don't really see that, right? So the Yankees are still starting all their stars, even though the pennant was long gone, foregone conclusion. But what happens with a lot of these great teams, and the 86 Mets were clearly a great team by any measure, is that they win the pennant, and then these games that come after they win the pennant are just unimportant, and they just put whoever out there, right? That's the problem that you have. And so when we're looking at this and trying to analyze, is this team better than that team, you're looking at a completely different setup, right? When you're talking about a team like the 86 Mets, they've won the division. They have gone on to the postseason. And so they just put out, a bunch of their second stringers. They're going to try a bunch of guys who are in AAA, see how they do against Major League pitching, right? Whereas if you have a team like the 1940 Tigers, they don't have that luxury. Their first team is playing every single game and has to, and they have to really fight hard to win. Well, you could argue that the team that had to fight hard to the end because they had real competition in the end ends up looking superior to the team that spent a lot of September putting out the likes of, who did we have here? Stan Jefferson, or Dave Magadan. I like Stan Jefferson a lot. I want to make fun of him. But Dave Magadan, Tim Tuffle, Lee Mazzilli, John Gibbons, Rick Anderson, the starting pitcher, right? These are not the sort of guys you would normally associate with a really good, really powerful team. So anyway, there you go. That's just a little bit of thought from me. I would be very interested to know what you think about this subject, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.